My name is Jon Sweeney, and my book is The Pope Who Quit, a true medieval tale of mystery, death, and salvation. The Pope Who Quit is about Celestine V, the first man to ever willingly step down as Pope. Dante referred to what Celestine V did as the Great Refusal. A lot of historians and a lot of commentators declared Celestine V to be a coward. I think that in the end it wasn't an act of cowardice, it actually was an act of enlightenment. It was an act of deciding to be a faithful follower of Christ as opposed to Pope, which in those days meant someone who was vying for political, material, power of all sorts of other kinds that this character, Celestine V, had no interest in. And I wanted to tell the story because I saw it a different way. I wrote it as a work of medieval history. I like to tell moments in time in history in a popular vein. I like to make them more widely accessible to people. It was an interesting time in the history of the church. The previous pope had died. For more than 2 years, there's this interregnum or gap when the families that kind of controlled the College of Cardinals, Orsini and Colonna, were not settling on a candidate because they each wanted to get their own guy in. So Celestine V, who at that time was Peter of Morone, a hermit living up in the mountains in his 80s, who had founded monasteries and who supervised other hermits, sends a letter to a man named Cardinal Latino Malabranca, who was the dean of the College of Cardinals. The letter must have said something like, "How dare you not elect a pope when the church all over the world is waiting for spiritual and moral guidance?" And he said it in such a way of strength that Latino then used a method for electing a pope which is no longer allowed. It's called inspiration, inspired by the Holy Spirit. So he called out Peter Morone's name and said, "I nominate Peter Morone," and everyone else in the room eventually agreed. So Peter is then elected pope. When they came to get him to give him the glorious news that he'd been elected pope, I mean, he actually ran away and they had to sort of drag him back. He's completely confused by what goes on in the papacy. So after 15 weeks of a disastrous reign as pope, Peter steps down and just sort of simply walks back to his mountain. But then the pope who replaces him, Gaetani, who becomes Boniface VIII, quickly realizes you can't have two popes running around. So he literally sends out people to sort of hunt him down in the woods. They get him, they take him to a prison, and 2 years later, Peter's dead. So there's speculation. Why did Peter die? How did Peter die? What was the role of Boniface VIII in all of this? It's an interesting story of a man who was a spiritual figure living in an era that we can't even imagine today in the 21st century, the idea that the Pope would be the most powerful man in the world. We think of the Pope as simply being the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. And Peter Morone, Celestine V, would have felt pretty comfortable in that role, I think. I hope that my book will be read by people who love things like television shows or movies that deal with this time period. I tried to tell it in a colorful way that would appeal beyond those who have spiritual or religious reasons for turning to it. I think the Showtime Borgia series is a good example of the way in which people get excited about this period of time in history. That period that the Borgia deals with is not too separated from what we're talking about here. Those are the kinds of examples of late medieval history that is full of the sort of color and character that I am attracted to myself and that I've tried to portray in this book.